Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's begin today's comprehensive news analysis with the first article that talks about the importance of parliamentary committees and the fact that in the past few years, these parliamentary committees have not been utilized as much as they should have. The author here is a former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, means he's a retired IAS officer, and he focuses on the farm bills that the Prime Minister recently announced will be taken back by the government. Rather than going into the details of the content of the bills, the author here is making an argument that one of the reasons that these bills led to such a wide scale protest in the country was that no consultative process was followed by the government. The author says that ideally, such important bills should be referred to parliamentary committees so that a large scale discussion can be held and people's view can be accommodated, and only then these bills should be passed. If that would have been the case, maybe it would not have resulted in such a large agitation. The author says that the bills were first introduced as an ordinance, which in itself was a very bad beginning. Article 123 empowers the President of India to promulgate ordinances in situations where an urgent law is required and at least one of the houses is not in session. However, for such farm bills, there was no urgency that was required. So, the basis of passing the ordinance itself is a matter of debate. Secondly, after the ordinances were passed, when the parliament started its meeting, the bill to convert the ordinance into a permanent law should ideally have been referred to a committee. The author says that there is a misconception amongst many people that if a bill is introduced to replace an ordinance, it is not referred to a standing committee of the parliament. The author says that this is factually incorrect. There is no law that says that a bill to replace the ordinance cannot go to a standing committee. In fact, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha chairman have complete authority to refer any bill except a money bill to the standing committees in the parliament. As you know, the parliament has two types of committees, standing and ad hoc. Standing committees means those that are permanent in nature. The members keep on changing, but the committees as such are not dissolved. Ad hoc committees, on the other hand, are the ones that are formed for a specific purpose. Once that purpose or discussion is done, the committees are then dissolved. I'm sure in Indian polity, you have already read about a lot of parliamentary standing committees, including the Estimates Committee, the Public Account Committee, and the various department related committees that we have in the parliament. The main purpose of having parliamentary committees is to allow a detailed discussion on important matters where in a closed room meeting people of different political parties can come together and discuss important issues about the bill. That is what allows the public also to know the points of view of different political parties. In fact, if you go back in the history, in the 13th century, the British Parliament was formed on the very same basis. When the rulers of England realized that it is time for the people to know the points of view of different leaders in the country, and they can't just depend upon the kings and the queens taking all their decisions. India's parliamentary system is fortunate to have a lot of parliamentary committees for various purposes. Unfortunately, however, they have not been utilized in the past. Let's look at some of the issues with regards to the parliamentary committees. Now, the parliamentary committees in India derive their authority from two important articles. Article 105 that talks about the privileges given to the members of parliament, the privileges to discuss, the privileges to debate and make their voices heard, and Article 118 that talks about the parliament's authority to make rules for regulating its own procedure and conduct of business. Now, interestingly, the Parliament of India only has three sessions in a year, and in the past few years, the number of meetings and the number of working days in the parliament are on a considerable decline. On the other hand, the committees can meet throughout the year. They don't require a parliament session to meet. A committee can meet throughout the year at any pre decided place in a closed door. So the parliamentary committees can be much more productive as compared to the entire parliament. Second, it also allows interministerial coordination. Let me give you an example. Let's assume the Ministry of Railways has introduced a bill with regards to expansion of the railway network. Now, when you are expanding the railway network, you might need to acquire land from a lot of farmers. You might need to cut down trees to expand the network. So the railway ministry would have to work with many other ministries, example the environment ministry. But when the bill is introduced, it is introduced by one single ministry. Now the railway ministry, while introducing the bill, would not have had a chance to discuss the same with the environmental ministry. A parliamentary committee, on the other hand, gives them this chance, since a parliamentary committee would have representation from various committees and various political parties. As I said earlier, it also allows for a much detailed discussion as compared to what happened in the parliament, since they act as a mini parliament. Another extremely important point here is that since the meetings of these committees are held in a closed door manner, that means the members of the committee are free from the whip of their party. Now, whip means an order from the party high command that the members of the party cannot ignore. Otherwise, they would be disqualified under anti defection law. Let me give you an example. The BJP introduced the farm bills in the parliament. Let's imagine there is a member of parliament from the BJP who did not agree with the farm bill. But still, that member of parliament would have to vote yes because he is or she is bound by the whip of the party. He or she cannot vote against the bill or cannot even raise any objection against the bill. However, in a closed door meeting, the same member of parliament is not covered under the whip and can raise his views even if they are against that particular bill introduced by his own party. The reason is when the committee's report is formed, individual members' statements are not recorded. So his or her party leadership would not know what is he thinking about, but at least he can air his views so that people in the committee can get an idea. The problem with these committees is that the number of bills that are referred to these committees are on a decline. As you can see from the chart, in the 16th Lok Sabha, that is the last one, only 27% bills were referred to the committees, as compared to 60% and 70% in the 14th and the 15th Lok Sabhas. In fact, even some of the most important bills, such as the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Bill, the farm bills, have not been referred to this committee. In the past, there have been multiple bills where the committees have played a very important role by giving their important inputs. For example, the National Medical Commission Bill 2017, when referred to the committee, had a lot of great inputs which were incorporated in the bill. Similarly, the Consumer Protection Bill of 2019 was also referred to a committee on food and consumer affairs that suggested multiple changes which were included in the bill, making the law much better, thus underlining the importance of parliamentary committees and making the author's point that it should not be neglected. In fact, parliaments around the world also have given a lot of power to their committees. If you follow the American politics, you would know that in the American upper house, that is the Senate, they have a lot of very powerful committees that even have the power to call for questioning very powerful people such as Mark Zuckerberg and other corporate leaders. The second article that we will discuss today focuses on China's increasing nuclear capabilities. This article is written in the light of a recent report called China Military Power Report that was released by Pentagon, that is the American Defense Establishment. It's a very common exercise under which the Pentagon releases multiple reports not just on China but also on other countries around the world, including India. This report says that China has been on a mission to increase its nuclear capability without being 100% transparent about the same. It says that the People's Republic of China is adding multiple weapons in its artillery and is focusing on four key areas, that is, quantitative strength, atomic yield, the delivery capabilities, and the posture. Let's discuss these four in detail. First, the number of nuclear warheads that China has is on a steep increase. For instance, the report says that by the end of 2027, China would have about 700 nuclear weapons, which is about a 3.5 times increase of the current strength of 200. Not just this, by the end of 2030, their nuclear stockpile will reach 1,000 weapons. Just for comparison, the stockpile that America has of nuclear weapons is 3,750, which is a sharp decline from the earlier stockpile. It is said that in the beginning of the 21st century, America used to have 10,000 nuclear weapons, which they have decreased to 3,750, and they are not planning to increase it anytime soon. Secondly, China is also working to develop low yield weapons so that they can be used in a face to face war with little collateral damage. Meaning that they are developing nuclear bombs that would be smaller in size, that would be much easier to control, and would be helpful in hitting pinpoint targets. Just like India uses Pokhran as its nuclear test facility, China uses a place called Lop Nur as its nuclear facility. Over the past few years, China has declined access to this nuclear facility to inspectors from around the world, which is raising questions about China's intentions, specifically with regard to the low yield weapons. Thirdly, the authors say that China has been adding a lot of new missiles in its artillery. For example, they recently released the DF 26 ballistic missile, which is an intermediate range ballistic missile. China also developed the JL-2 submarine launched ballistic missiles with a range of 7,200 kilometers, making it an intercontinental ballistic missile. Just for comparison, India's largest range ballistic missile is Agni 5 with a range of 5,000 kilometers. Not just this, author also says that China is moving towards a launch on warning nuclear system. Now, what does this mean? Launch on warning means if China's systems get a warning that another country has launched nuclear weapons towards China. Even before those weapons hit China, China would already launch its nuclear weapons. This is called launch on warning. Even if it is a false warning that the systems identify themselves, even then the weapons would launch themselves. That is why it is extremely dangerous. This makes the possibility of a machine error much higher, and that is why the world is concerned regarding this. Not just this, during the COVID 19 pandemic, when the entire world was running towards making medical supplies, China added two new types of weapons, that is, Type 094 nuclear powered ballistic submarines to their already extremely strong fleet. While all this information is given in this article from the Hindu newspaper, it also allows us to look beyond this and see how China has been increasing its influence in the global world. I have here for you a very interesting graph that shows how China is increasing its influence in global institutions by making use of its money power. In the past decade, China's contribution to many global organizations has increased considerably, which has allowed China to gain support of many not so powerful nations. As you can see, in 2019, China was the largest contributor in UNESCO, sixth largest contributor in WHO, the eighth largest contributor in FAO, and even in the other organizations, it has been increasing its strength by giving a lot more money as compared to earlier, thus attracting smaller countries towards its own influence. This also allows us a chance to revisit the concept of no first use policy. No first use policy simply means that a nuclear country says that we will not be the first one to use nuclear weapons. We will only use them when we are attacked by some other country. The interesting part is China right now is the only nuclear armed country in the world to actually have a no first use policy. Even India's own no first use policy has certain conditions. That is, our no first use policy says that if India is attacked with a chemical or a biological weapon, even then we would be willing to use our nuclear weapons. Although this is only a policy on paper. So, for example, if China tomorrow fires the first nuclear weapon against any country, you can't hold China accountable in any court because it is a voluntary announcement made on their behalf. Same is with India. The reason why India follows the no first use policy is it allows us to have a much better image at the international level and allows us to have a lot of exceptions when it comes to dealing with nuclear material without signing treaties such as the NPT. Other nations such as France, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, UK, or even the US have not adopted the no first use policy. There was a debate a few months back when our Defense Minister Rajnath Singh said that although right now we have the no first use policy, but the future of the policy will depend on the circumstances. However, India has not made any announcement of changing this policy till date. The next article that we have talks about the need to conduct the census as soon as possible because, as per the authors, a delay in census would result in bad policy making. The authors say that in a country like India with such a huge population, effective policies are those which are made by the help of accurate data, and census plays an extremely important role in the same. As you know, because of the COVID pandemic, the 2021 census has been delayed quite considerably. The authors here say that apart from a delay in the census numbers, there are some other concerns also that we need to look into. For example, the authors say that the government has not released the data from socio-economic and caste census, thus raising questions about the government's intentions. Secondly, the government also in the past few years has changed the method of calculating the GDP, which makes it difficult to compare the data that we have now as compared to the earlier years. Also, the sample surveys means a small set of questionnaire that many government departments carry on throughout the year also keep on changing their questions. When you keep changing questions year after year, it becomes extremely difficult to compare the data over the years and see if any change has been observed in the data or not. Thus, in the absence of all this data, the effectiveness of the government's policies start declining. Let me give you one more example. The PDS program run by the government of India allows highly subsidized food grains to two-thirds of India's population. Now, as per the last census, when India's population was about 120 crore, two-third population meant 80 crore people are getting food grains from the PDS at a subsidized rate. Now, it is estimated that India's population would be about 137 crore, meaning that about 92 crore people should be covered under the PDS by calculating the two-third of this number. But because the census data is delayed and this number has not been officially declared, meaning that the additional 12 crore people who should have been covered under the PDS scheme are still not covered because the government has delayed this data. Although the once in a decade conducted census is not the only source for this data. For example, we have the monthly household consumer expenditure data. We also have the National Family Health Survey. However, the authors say that the government in the past few years has not been very transparent with the data. The authors say that in November 2019, government announced that the data collected in 2017-18 through monthly household consumer expenditure cannot be released because it has some quality issues, although those issues have never been revealed. The authors also point out that just by conducting a census exercise does not mean that we will always have accurate data. In the past, there have been many allegations of the census data not being correct and the data being misrepresented at multiple levels. Now, to understand this better, let's look at the concept of census, its history in India, and how is it different this time around. The concept of census goes a long way back. In fact, Kautilya's Arthashastra also mentions that the state must have an accurate count of the number of people living under its jurisdiction so that proper policies based on taxation can be made. Not just this, Akbar also, in his administrative report Akbari, mentions about the comprehensive data with regards to population, industry, wealth, and other things about the people living under the jurisdiction. In modern India, the census exercise began in 1872 in small parts. The first All India survey was only conducted in 1881. Thus, the 2021 survey will be the 16th such census conducted and 8th since our independence. Also, the 2021 census, which got delayed due to the pandemic, has a lot of interesting characteristics. That is, for the first time, data would be captured digitally. The enumerators who will collect the census data will be given an app on their smartphone. They will update the data on the app and it will be safely stored in real time. Not just this, when a person conducting the census comes to your place, asks you about the details of your family, you would not have to show any paperwork. Whatever you say verbally will be considered as the correct information by the person taking the data. This census activity will have a multi language support to ensure that people from all the backgrounds can easily understand and participate. A controversial point here is that no caste based data will be collected, a point which many opposition parties were fighting against with the government. Also, for the first time, the data will have a column for transgender count. Earlier, the census data only identified people as either male or female, but now a third category of transgender has also been added. The next article that we have focuses on life expectancy in India and how is it different for people living in poverty. A recent report released by the Azim Premji University says that life expectancy amongst the poor male population in urban areas is lesser by 9.1 years as compared to average, while amongst the poor women it is lesser by 6.2 years as compared to the national average. The report says that about one third of India's population lives in the urban areas, and out of that population, about 30% people are considered as poor. The poor people also have to face more disease burden, which is very common because of their lack of nutritional diet, because of lack of hygiene. They are much more susceptible to diseases as compared to other population. The report also points out that India suffers from a problem of extremely low public health expenditure, specifically by the urban local bodies, thus leading to even the poor people opting for private healthcare, thus spending much more money than what they ideally should. The report says that a good beginning can be implementing the urban health mission, having a better coordination between the different levels of public healthcare system so that the people's health issues can be taken care of. Now over here there's a very interesting point that you need to understand. The word poor is a very generic word that we see and use in multiple reports. However, it is also important to understand how do we define a poor person or poverty. In India, there have been multiple committees formed in the past to define the word poor. For example, in 1979, the Alag Committee said that a person who consumes less than 2100 calories in urban areas in a day and less than 2400 calories in a rural area would be considered as a poor person. The difference between these calories was because it was assumed that a person living in rural areas would have to do more physical labor, so they need more calories. Interestingly, they only talked about food. This committee did not take into consideration education and health. Thus, another committee was formed called Lakdawala Committee in 1993, which apart from the calorie intake also included health and education components to define whether a person is poor or not. Rather than taking the calorie count, it talked about how much money should a person have in a house to live a normal life. Then came the Tandulkar Committee of 2009. The committee said that for rural areas, a person spending 27 rupees in a day, and for urban areas, a person spending 33 rupees in a day would be above the poverty line. So anyone who is spending less than 27 rupees a day in rural areas and less than 33 rupees in a day in an urban area would be considered as poor. With this estimate, the committee said about 21.5% of India's population is poor. After the committee's report came out, many people said that the committee is favoring the government by giving a very low level of poverty line. That is, people said that far more people in India are poor. Just by spending 27 rupees in a day, you can't afford food, you can't afford other amenities that you require. However, the government was happy with the committee report because it allowed them to highlight that the number of poor people in India have reduced under their rule. Because of this criticism, the government made another committee called Rangarajan Committee of 2012. This committee said that in a rural area, a person needs on an average 32 rupees a day. In urban areas, a person needs on an average 47 rupees per day for a normal life. Anyone spending lesser than this would be considered as poor. By this estimate, 29.5% of India's population came under poverty levels. As you can see, the government did not like this report because they could not tell the people that under our watch, more people are becoming poor. Thus, the definition of poverty still remains a highly contested issue. The governments in power always want a lower line so that they can say that we have reduced the poverty in India. On the other hand, if the line is too low, meaning that if the number of poor people in India officially are too low, it would also be harmful for the government because in that case, we would not be able to take concessional loans from the international authorities. Internationally, also, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank have their own rate of poverty. The World Bank, for example, defines a person as extremely poor if the person is living on less than $1.9 a day, adjusted for inflation as well as price differences. The Asian Development Bank says that a person having less than $1.51 per day is poor. As you can see with their estimate, the number of poor people in India would be much higher. The next article from today's newspaper that we will discuss is with regards to the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh commissioning the INS Vishakhapatnam, which is a guided missile destroyer. This is a part of India's Project 15B, under which we are making 4 stealth guided missile destroyers, with INS Vishakhapatnam being the first one. The defense minister also said that a lot of countries are not respecting international laws such as a UN clause, which is leading to a lot of law and order issues, especially for smaller littoral nations around the world. This specific ship is packed with weapons and sensors such as a BrahMos surface-to-surface missile and Barak 8 surface-to-air missiles. Also, do note that Barak 8 is a joint venture between India and Israel. Now, although this article does not give us a lot of other facts, it does give us certain keywords that we need to understand. First being the UN clause, second being INS Vishakhapatnam, third being the Project 15B. So let's dive deeper into all these. So UN clause stands for United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that came up in 1982. This convention defines the concept of territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. I'm sure that all of you would have read about the exclusive economic zone. If you can see this picture, territorial zone means 12 nautical miles from your land, from your coastline. After this, 200 nautical miles is the area that is called exclusive economic zone or EEZ. The concept is very simple. In the territorial water, the country has complete sovereignty. Means if another country's ship is entering these waters, India has the right to say no to them. Even the airspace over this area would be under the government's control. After this starts international airspace, but 200 nautical miles area from the coastline is called exclusive economic zone, meaning that in this area, any mineral wealth that is found will belong to us. So we have the exclusive right of taking out any mineral wealth from exclusive economic zone, which is up to 200 nautical miles. India, in fact, has been carrying out a lot of research in these areas in search for a lot of minerals, including the manganese nodules. This was about the UN clause. Apart from this, you also need to know about Project 15B and what are the other components of this. So, the Indian Navy uses a lot of different types of ships which have been made under different projects. The first such project under which the government itself made ships for the Navy was the Delhi class project in 1990s. It was called Project P-15. This was followed by another project called 15A and also given the code name Kolkata class. The third such project is called Project 15B, that is P15B, also called as the Vishakhapatnam class. This project, the one that is ongoing right now, 15B, has a total of four guided missile destroyers. The first one is INS Vishakhapatnam that has been handed over to the Navy. Apart from that, the three others are INS Mormugao, INS Imphal, and INS Surat, all of whom are under different stages of construction. The Project 15B is being built by Mazgaon Dock Shipbuilders Limited, which is a public sector undertaking under the Government of India. These were the articles that we wanted to discuss from today's Hindu newspaper. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, in the Indian context, bring out the correlation between health and poverty with suitable arguments. Second, an important parliamentary reform often overlooked is empowering the parliamentary committees, enabling them to keep a check on executive's powers. Suggest measures to revive the fortunes of these committees. Both of these have to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.